it's on wheels, so it should.
Yeah, just in case it needs.
And then I can slide this over here. All right. Here today as well.
Yeah, sure.
What is your address?
Good.
We, in ours, we have the stuff coming up through the floor, so you have to sort of lift it before you can wheel it out.
Yeah, it's nice to have that right on wheels.
I'm just gonna run down.
Are you watching music?
What's up? I'm here to listen.
Yeah, something.
So this is going to be on YouTube?
Yes, it'll be live streamed and it'll save it tonight. Yes. It's actually.
Okay. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, this is not a bad picture.
Yeah. Y'all might want to move forward to see more clearly on the screen.
Is this where the cool kids?
No, I should over there. Notes.
Under.
Yes, this is the almost. He's the real.
You have the historian.
Yes, true historian scientist.
Yeah, I know. I forgot my poncho.
So I mean, you'll be open, I presume. Yes.
Where'd everybody go?
Great.
Oh, okay.
Feel free to, Jim, feel free to move this if you need it all. Okay? If you need to adjust this at all, you just.
I pushed it out of the way.
Okay.
I project pretty well, but that would pick up the screen.
Yeah, it'll be best for the stream. At the back there, you just don't worry about it. You can figure that out.
Okay.
That's too loud.
I don't like to be constrained. So I move around.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, if you need to move around, that's okay.
Okay.
Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to this session with speaker Jim Hughes and Creation Ministries International. Title Evolution versus Biblical Creation. We're excited to just study this morning. Really, we have the opportunity to think deeply about some of the wonderful works of God in creation and His glory that is bound to His name as the Creator and the Lord of heaven and earth. And so I'm just going to open us in prayer again for this session now, and we'll ask for the Lord's blessing upon our time together. So would you pray with me once again? Father, we are so honored to have this time with Jim, the speaker that you have sent to us from CMI. We thank you for this opportunity to dig deep, as it were, into the glories of your world from the lens of your word. And I pray, Lord, that you would indeed give us that discernment and illumination of your Holy Spirit who leads us into all truth, not just so that we might know that which is true and real and good and beautiful, but also that we might be better equipped and prepared to defend it, to share these truths with those around us, families and family members and friends and neighbors, that, Lord, you might make us instruments in your hands to spread that knowledge of the glory of God to the ends of the earth, both here in Kingston and missionary endeavors. Lord, we desire that you would be glorified in the earth. And part of the necessity of that as well, it's in what was just said, in the earth, and you are the creator of the earth. And so help us to understand these things now. Bless us in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you for coming. Just a little bit of personal background that I thought I would mention. Byron, who you all know, Byron and I have known each other, for 50 years or something? And Byron's sister Faye is one of our best friends. So, and my daughter Alisa is back here. She's come to join us. So there are personal connections here. So what I'm going to deal with today is an overview of the debates dealing with evolution versus biblical creation. When we go to a church for the first time, we do an overview talk. If we come back within 5 years, then we can go into more detail. So this is our first visit to this church. So it'll be an overview presentation. I have 15 different presentations, so I can go into any of these topics in quite a bit of depth. And the problem is I tend to take tangents all the time. Byron, you know what it's like taking tangents, right? So, the question that we are confronted with is people will say, well, why should we care about this? Couldn't God have used evolution as his mechanism for bringing about the variety of life that we see around us? Let's look at some instances of what evolutionists will tell you about mankind. So Bertrand Russell, mathematician or philosopher, he said mankind is a curious accident in a backwater. Or Peter Atkins, another UK professor, just a bit of slime on the planet. Or Stephen Jay Gould, who spent much of his career at Harvard attempting to explain the missing links through something he called punctuated equilibrium. What does he say? Mankind is a fortuitous cosmic afterthought on the bush of life. The only one of these individuals who's still alive is Richard Dawkins. And he says we live in a universe which has no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So when you start with the foundation of evolution, mankind is what? A bag of chemicals. There is no basis for morality. And we see some of the legacy of 170 years or so of evolution around us in the moral chaos in our society right now. Now, it's not only because of evolution, because you go back to that verse in Genesis 6:5, the thoughts and the intents of the heart are only wicked all the time. But certainly evolution has contributed to it. Now, in contrast, when we start with the foundation of biblical creation, we get a very different perspective on reality. I'm asking this question right now. I'm going to come back and I'm going to ask you to answer this question. Why did I put biblical creation below God's word? Isn't the most important thing from a Christian perspective God's word? Think about why I did that. In the first 11 chapters of Genesis, we have essentially the entire Bible in seed form. All of the key concepts, doctrines, beliefs, messages are found in seed form in those first 11 chapters. What do you find there, for example? Genesis 1:26. We find the cultural mandate, some theologians refer to it as man's dominion over the rest of the creation, clearly demarcating a differentiation between mankind as one part of the creation and the rest of the creation. We find there God giving a command, law, to Adam and Eve. You shall not eat of a particular tree. So morality is already there. And of course, then we see the events in chapter 3 when sin is introduced. We find marriage defined in terms of Adam and Eve, male and female, and they shall cling to one another. We also find the gospel in Genesis 3:15 with the announcement that the seed of Eve would conquer Satan and serpent. So there's so much in those first 11 chapters, beside the very fact that God declares himself to be a creator. Now, why did I put biblical creation below God's word? Anybody want to suggest why I did that?
As creation comes through his word.
Sorry?
As the creation comes through his word.
That's interesting. Very interesting, yes. What is the very first verse of the Bible?
In the beginning, God
Created, right. In the beginning, God created. Do you see what God does there? The very first attribute that he wants us to know about himself is that he's a creator. And then when we go to verse 3, and God said, he now tells us that he's a communicator. He is first and foremost a creator, and then he is a communicator. Think about it. Throughout Scripture, how often does God defend himself as the creator? Go to the book of Revelation. What do we find there? You are worthy, O God, to receive glory and honor. Why? Because you created all things. In the book of Job, which is the oldest book of the Bible, now obviously some of the parts of Genesis 1 to 11 are older because they precede the flood. The book of Job was written before the time of Abraham, and you know those debates between Job and his supposed comforters. Where did God intervene? What does he say? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Right there, God is declaring that he's the creator. And take a tangent here, but even there, he says, look at Behemoth, the biggest creature I've made. And he says to Job, look at that. He uses that to defend himself. In the prophets, in Isaiah and Jeremiah, how does God defend himself against idolatry? As the creator. It's throughout the scriptures. It is an absolutely foundational, fundamental doctrine. That's why I put it at the bottom. Nothing else. Everything else relies on the fact that God is the creator. He has a right as the creator to give law. He has a right as the creator to define life and to take life, and so on and so on. It's a foundational doctrine. Now, we find within the church that there are many people who say, yeah, I believe that God created. I'm not sure how, but I believe that he's a creator. And they would also profess to have a Christian moral view. But we struggle to communicate with these people in the church who believe that theistic evolution is the mechanism that he used, or this concept of deep time, that the universe is 13.8 billion years old and the earth is 4.5 billion years old. A Pew Research study was done, and they polled people by their denominational affiliation and their beliefs about God using evolution. 38% of people who self-declared to be evangelical Protestants said that they believe God used evolution as his mechanism. So this is the challenge that CMI is dealing with. Our mission is to churches. That's our focus at CMI, because we believe it's fundamental that we lay a proper foundation and understanding about God as a creator in churches. We don't go out to universities and debate, although occasionally Richard might, he's our CEO of Canada, he might speak at the university context. We will speak at Christian schools if we're invited, but our primary focus is to churches. We are a federation of organizations, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, United States, Canada, the UK, and Europe. And so we are a federation of organizations. We work together on the website, on publishing, and super conferences and all those kinds of things. In Canada, we have 7 speakers. 3 of them are on full-time staff. They do other things. And the other 4 of us are just part-time. I am just a volunteer. I basically agree to go out 4 Sundays in the spring and 4 in the fall, because I think it's important to be involved in our local church. And I do contribute through writing scripts for our Creation Magazine Live and articles and those kinds of things. So we have 7 speakers in Canada, and we only focus on doing presentations in Canada. Our offices are in Kitchener, and we have a recording studio there, really sophisticated, a big green room, and lots of really powerful ways of animation and so on. You can see some of this stuff on Creation Magazine Live. Now, what happens is when young people, say they've been homeschooled or they've gone to a Christian school, if they don't get a good foundation in understanding biblical creation, they confront the secular world. I was speaking in Alliston a few years ago, and there were 2 young women who were attending. They were both in 3rd-year chemistry at Trent in Peterborough. And during the luncheon after my presentation, I asked them what it was like. And they said in 1st year, every single course was pushing evolution. By the time they got into 3rd year, it had basically disappeared, because you get into actual experimental science, and there's nothing in evolution that's experimental science. And so, but what happens is when young people are confronted with evolutionary thinking, they tend to have doubts. For example, one chaplain in the US university said when he would poll students in freshman year, many of them would say, like something like 80% would say they believe in God. If you polled them in 2nd year, the number had dropped to 15%. Something is influencing them in the secular universities. And so young people struggle and question. These are the kinds of questions that they will come up with. And many of you may have similar types of questions. Like I was speaking one place and I mentioned the Ice Age. And one of the persons during the, do you really believe there was an ice age? You know, that kind of thing. And we have very good models on how to explain the ice age based on the Genesis flood, those kinds of things. When I started getting interested in this topic, I was invited, we had Interschool Christian Fellowship. I went to a high school called Sir John A. Macdonald Collegiate. I was pleased to see that we still have a street here named Sir John A. Macdonald. There were attempts in our Toronto School Board to rename our school Jarvis Street Collegiate and one other, because, you know, this revisionist history stuff. Thankfully, the province overruled them and said, don't waste the money. I think it was going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. But we had Interschool Christian Fellowship, and one of my good friends, Ron Williamson, actually he is in Ottawa, and he's still a close friend of mine. He invited me to Wishing-Well Acres Baptist Church down on Shepherd. And he said, and the speaker there was a man named Whitcomb. And he and Morris had written a book called The Genesis Flood. And that was, came out, I think, in 1969 or thereabouts. It was the seminal work in the creation space. And I just have consumed stuff since then. And when I was in university, I worked in the science center as my part-time job, and basically I took all these science courses 4 times, and never had to write an exam, which is a good way to take the course. So it is unbelievable today what is available to us to defend biblical creation with evidences from science compared to when Morrison Whitcomb wrote in the Genesis flood. The material, the thinking that has gone on demonstrates that Evan, you were saying to me about the rationality of Christianity. The evidences overwhelmingly support biblical creation now. And as Richard, our CEO, often says, it's a great time to be a Christian. It really is, because evolution is in its last breath, and it's clinging. Now, I've used the term evolution, so I need to define it. I was speaking in Markham last Sunday, at Markham Missionary Church, and we had a Q&A, and somebody asked me, well, do we talk about macroevolution and microevolution? We don't use those kinds of terms. That just confuses the picture. I'm going to give you the evolutionist definition of evolution. If you get nothing else out of this, understand the evolutionist definition of evolution, because it will help you to see what's going on here. So according to evolutionists, all of life originated from a single cell. Now let's not worry about chemical evolution, pre-biological evolution, how all that got there. Let's just start right now with a single cell. It can't be a virus. Why can't it be a virus? Yeah, there had to have been other life there for a virus. So it has to be something like a bacteria, we'll just say. Of course, it would have been a proto-bacteria, according to that, something like that. The simplest bacteria that we are aware of today that has the essential components of life, like the ability to move, the ability to reproduce, to respirate, breathe, to consume food, and so on, has roughly 480 genes. 480 genes. Over time, according to evolutionists, genetic information has been increasing and increasing from that 480 genes to the vast amount of genetic information that's out there in plants, single-cell entities, and animals. And it's a huge amount of genetic information that has come out. When you get to the individual instance of mankind, we've gone, just on humans, we've gone from 480 genes to 25,000 genes encoded in our DNA. And that doesn't account for all the other genes and genetic information that's out there in all of the plant and animal and single cell entities. So over time, genetic information has been increasing. All of the plants and species up there represent the current plants and animal species, represent the current representation of genetic information. Some has died out. Some is found only in the fossil record. Some died out during the Ice Age. What's the example of creatures that died in the Ice Age? The woolly mammoth, the saber-toothed cat, the giant sloth, and so on, right? So some genetic information has disappeared. Some only are found in the fossil record. Some has died out in more recent, during the human history period. There are also the branches. There is no evidence of the existence of any genetic information on the branches. Everything out there is discrete, and this is what has been driving, like Stephen Jay Gould, to distraction, because if an evolutionary process actually occurred, it should be continuous, and it's not, it's discrete. And so he had to come up with a method called punctuated equilibrium to try to address why there's nothing found in the fossil record and yet evolution occurred. It's not a term we invented, the missing links. It's a term evolutionists invented. So here's Lynn Margulis, no longer alive. An evolutionist definition of evolution. Every form of life on Earth, oak tree and elephant, bird and bacteria, shares a common ancestry. This is the evolutionary paradigm that everything originated from a single cell, somewhere. This isn't evolution. When you have human-directed selection and you have breeds of dogs, what happens to the genetic information? Can you breed from a Chihuahua a Great Dane? You can't, because they've lost genetic information. They have enough genetic information that in theory you could breed them together. I'm not sure what you'd get if you breed a Chihuahua and a Great Dane, but they've lost genetic information. If you want a robust dog, what do you want?
Retriever.
That's highly specialized too. Now, what do you want if you want a robust dog? A mutt. You want to bring back some genetic variety and diversity. What's happening with human-directed selection in breeding is you've actually lost genetic information. It's devolution, not evolution. If you had a generic fox that was in the Arctic, and the generic fox could give birth to white foxes and brown foxes, what's going to happen to the brown foxes? They're going to be polar bear food. And over a few generations, the result is going to be only white foxes. The adaptation is going to go toward the white, and they're actually going to lose genetic information, and that white fox could never give birth to a brown fox anymore. It's just the information's gone. This is devolution, not evolution. And speciation is devolution. When species form, they actually come from a kind, a biblical kind, that had a broader spectrum of genetic information. And through the small breeding populations, they actually reduce the amount of genetic information that's available. Here's on the plant side. This is a tea that has been found in China that is caffeine-free. How many of you had a tea or a coffee this morning? Most people. Did y'all have caffeinated ones? Most of you. Yeah. I think that a decaffeinated tea might be a bestseller at some point. I am not a big fan of chemically decaffeinated tea or coffee. Do you see up in the upper right there? One of the ways that they decaffeinate chemically is they use a solvent that is basically nail polish remover. When you use that chemical, the remnants of it are far more harmful to you than the caffeine. Why do plants have caffeine? Why? Anybody know? Yeah.
Is it to encourage animals to eat it so that the seeds will be disseminated in their excrement?
No, it's actually the opposite, but interesting. That's interesting because there is some creatures that eat the the coffee beans, and then they excrete them, and you get this really fancy coffee that's gone through the digestive tract. No, that's a different thing. What is the reason that cocoa, tea, coffee plants have caffeine?
It's a repellent.
Yeah, it's an insecticide. It's a pesticide. So when you drink tea or coffee, you're actually drinking a pesticide. Woo. Now, it doesn't kill us in small quantities, and I'd actually rather have a little caffeine there than drink nail polish remover. So, now this tea was found in China, and it is caffeine-free. And you notice The Economist says that it lost the ability to produce an enzyme, and that enzyme is called caffeine synthase. Fancy name, means synthesize caffeine, make caffeine. Now that plant is not going to survive very well in the wild. And if you're going to grow farm grade tea, you need plantations, you have to have thousands and thousands of these plants, and it takes about 7 years for a tea plant to mature so that you can take its leaves. And they're going to have to protect these plants somehow, maybe using artificial pesticides. But notice the word the economist uses, evolution. This isn't evolution, it's devolution. It has lost genetic information. It has lost the ability to protect itself in the environment. And humans will have to cultivate it and take care of it. This is a bait and switch you see all the time in the literature. Another example that you will often see is the concept of antibiotic resistance in bacteria, superbugs. The interesting thing is that's not evolution either. The variant that is antibiotic resistance has always been in the human gut, for example, through all time. It's always been there. It's just that the others suppress it. What happens when you get an antibiotic, it kills the good bacteria and the other variant comes screaming back, and that takes over. Why we know that the antibiotic resistant variant has always been there is when one example, they found the frozen bodies of the Franklin expedition. These bodies were frozen a good 50 years before antibiotics came on the scene. And yet when they examined their stomach contents and their stool, they found antibiotic-resistant bacteria there. That is an evolution. It's a variant that has existed, and it comes roaring back. So watch for this. That's why it's very important you understand the evolutionist definition of evolution. We, in contrast, declare emphatically, based on the Word of God, that God created the entire universe in 6 natural consecutive days, and he did this about 6,000 years ago. I was speaking up in Aurelia a number of years ago, and there was a first-year university student at U of T, and boy, did he ever take an offense to my suggesting that God created everything, stars, everything, about 6,000 years ago. Well, you know, first-year university students are the smartest people on the face of the earth, aren't they? He really objected to me saying that. Just remember that 6,000 for later. I want to just do a quick sweep through some concepts. I want to present to you Genesis 1 is history. It's important. Death is the result of Adam's sin. We will see its significance momentarily. And then I want to look at some biological processes that evolutionists have difficulty explaining to give you an overview, and then a bit of evidence that the world cannot be billions of years old, and finally some facts that support the biblical flood. Now, as I mentioned earlier, on each of these topics, I literally have at least one hour presentation on each of them, and some of them multiple presentations. So we're going to have to do a very high level here. On the left-hand side is the evolutionary sequence. You start with, well, if you go to a book, Stephen Hawking's book, A Brief History of Time, and Carl Sagan writes the introduction, both of them say there was nothing, and then there was a quantum ripple. There was nothing, and then there was a quantum ripple. And out of that, plasma, then matter and coalesces and so on. And eventually you get the seas forming in some sort of soup of some sort, chemical soup, and the life comes out, and then eventually fish crawl onto land, that kind of stuff. You've seen it, right? That's the evolutionary sequence. On the right-hand side is the sequence right out of Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You cannot bring these two together. Do you see in this an absolutely fundamental discordant error line that just destroys a possibility to bring these two together. Do you see it in here? A very fundamental problem. It's absolutely unaddressable.
How is there light and energy before the sun?
Okay, that's a good one. God said right at the beginning, let there be light without a sun. So he himself was the source of light. And we know in Revelation that John says there was no sun because God is the light. So that's a very good one. You observe that. But it does hint at the actual problem.
Yeah.
What is the actual problem in these two sequences that's intractable, impossible to deal with? It's the fact on the third day in the biblical account, plant life is created. On the fourth day, the sun, moon, and all the celestial objects, the sextillion stars that are out there, were created on the fourth day. But according to evolutionists, the stars were created 10, 13 billion years ago. Depends on how long it takes to form a galaxy in their thinking. And plant life would go back about 2.5 billion years ago. That is intractable. You cannot rationalize these two. There have been various attempts in the Christian academic community to bring these two together. I have a presentation dealing with the different methods. They have a gap theory, a day-age theory, a framework hypothesis, and so on and so on. Attempts to rationalize these. Now, there's a basic law of logic that says if you have two ideas that contradict one another, we are talking about that law. It's called the law of non-contradiction. And if you have two concepts or ideas that contradict one another, at least one of them has to be false. Both could be false, but at least one of them has to be false. So at least one of these is false because they contradict one another. So which is it? Well, one of the schemes that is used as an attempt to suggest that Genesis 1 is not history is to say, well, it's poetry. So let's just use that as an illustration of how to deal with these various attempts. So Stephen Boyd, with a PhD in Hebrew and a statistical analysis, by the way, my dad did his doctoral work at the University of Glasgow on Hebrew verbs. And we're dealing with Hebrew verbs here. And in the Hebrew verbs, the form of the verb that's in narrative text, 1st and 2nd Samuel, is very different than the form of a verb that you will find in poetry, like the Book of Psalms. And overwhelmingly, the verb forms that are in Genesis 1 are narrative verb forms. So right away, in the Hebrew language, we're being told that this is a narrative account, not a poetic account. It's also presented as part of a historical chronology. We just start off with what God said, I did this, and I did this, and he told Adam what he'd done, and then it goes on right down to Abram in Genesis 11. It's just part of a historical chronology. And God tells us that he created in 6 days. Why did he create 6 days? Now, Augustine, in one of his books, suggested that God could have created instantly, but he chose to create in 6 days to set the pattern for our week. Why do we have a 7-day week? If you go and look at the secular explanations for why we have a 7-day week, I don't know what drug they've been smoking, but they don't have an explanation for it. If you're interested, I've written a paper that's up on our website, why we have a 7-day week. And I challenge the secular views on this. God chose to create over a 7-day period. He could have created instantly, but he chose to do it to set the pattern for our week. And there's another thing that's critical in the Hebrew, and in the Hebrew it's called the consecutive law. We translate law, it's a little stroke. Remember Jesus said a stroke, one of his accounts, not a stroke of the law will disappear, right? It's a little stroke. That can be translated as and or but then, now, and so on. If you go way back to the old King James, you get you see it much more clearly because they not always, but they usually translate it as that. But that consecutive, when it is applied, indicates that these events are occurring rapidly, consecutively, right after another in a time-based chronology. So this consecutive law indicates again these are events that are occurring one right after another in historical sequence. If you want to see an example of this, look at the Gospel of Mark and go back to the Old King James, or look at the book of Revelation and go back to the Old King James, and you'll see, particularly in Mark, there's this intensity. Probably Peter communicating this in Mark, writing it, but there's this intensity. Jesus did this, Jesus said, and it's just bam, 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 like that. So that is temporal sequencing. And then in the account, we have the ordinal. Day 1 is cardinal, day 1, but then it's second, third, fourth, and order. They're ordered. And if you go to Numbers 7 and Numbers 29, you see there that the sacrifices are being offered on the first day, the second day, the third day. Not a theologian on the face of the earth would tell you that Numbers 7 and 29 are not actual days, normal consecutive days, and yet they try to impose on Genesis 1. Oh, no, they can't be natural days. But God tells us they're natural days. Each day has an evening and a morning. Now, why evening and morning? Why an evening and morning? We use Roman reckoning and we say morning and evening. I won't go into the background on that, but it's basically paganism that's influenced us in terms of morning and evening. So, sorry, I didn't know your name, but in the right there, she was right there. You were talking about sun, the light before the sun. Remember? So this is actually why it's evening and morning, because the globe is already there and it's spinning, and it spins out of darkness into light. It goes from evening to morning. And that's where the Hebrew reckoning came from, because the very creation week, the globe is going from evening to morning, from darkness to light. And in the Ten Commandments, God says that he created in 6 days to set the pattern for the week. If he didn't create in the 6 days, then the analogy falls apart, and he's lying in the middle of the Ten Commandments. Not an auspicious place to be lying. We also have Jesus declaring that God created the male and female at the beginning. I had one little guy, he was probably about 6 years old, and he comes up to me afterwards and he says, "Mr. Hughes, you lie." What? And the kid obviously was bright because he paid a lot of attention. And he says, "No, Adam wasn't created on this at the beginning. He was created on the 6th day." Okay, you're right. So, but we know that Jesus is meaning during the creation week, not 13.8 billion years ago. So, and the rest of the Bible treats Genesis 1 as history. Now, I've spent the most time on this of the 5 topics that we're going to look at. Why? Because to be blunt, if we do not accept Genesis 1 as history, then why would we accept the virgin conception? Why would we accept the resurrection? If we can't take God at his word in Genesis 1 in the plain sense in which it's written, then I say shut your Bibles and throw them out. It's that simple. If we cannot accept the plain sense, I can't imagine how you could communicate more clearly in a universal sense what God did than what he has said. He couldn't have said, well, I created in 24 hours. 24 hours is a post-flood invention. Some say it came from Samaria, some say from Babylon, some say it came from Egypt, some even try to say it came from the Indus Valley. Where did 24 hours come from? So, how can you be any more clear than what God has said? Second topic, death was introduced as a result of Adam's sin. At the end of the creation week, God saw everything that he made, and he declared, what? It's all very good. Well, if there's been 540 million years of evolution in the sediment from the Precambrian and Cambrian all the way up, then what we find in the fossil record is carnivorism and death and decay and destruction. I don't care how you define the word good, but this isn't good. The death of animals, Nefeshkaya, the breathing creatures, is what we're dealing with here, and mankind was a result of Adam's sin. And every single fossil has to have been formed after Adam sinned. And therefore, right away, that throws out the entire geological column, because that's from the flood, not from millions and millions of years of supposed sedimentation. Paul makes an interesting analogy in 1 Corinthians 15, where he says there was a historical Adam whose sin brought death and decay into the universe. And therefore, we need a historical Christ that destroys death through his resurrection. That analogy completely falls apart if there isn't a historical Adam that brought sin into the world. Now, there are very many theologians right now, sadly, who are attempting to say, well, yes, the human death was a result of Adam's sin, but there was death before that in animals. So we have spent time putting together one of our Creation Magazine live episodes. We've had it going for 10 years, and this particular one, these episodes are 30 minutes in duration, because we used to actually broadcast it on television. The CRTC doesn't allow this kind of broadcasting anymore, but we have other channels that in God's providence have opened up. By the way, I think we have over 1 million subscribers now to our YouTube channel. They have just exploded, our media channels. But if you want to explore this particular episode is there, and you can examine it, because we defend there that Adam's sin brought death to living creatures, breathing creatures, not just to mankind. So you can go and look at that. Just as an aside, I wrote the script for this particular presentation, among others. Third topic I want to deal with is a sweep through problems that evolutionists cannot address, that if you're talking with a friend of yours, and much of this is, of course, available in our literature, and who says he believes in evolution, or she believes in evolution, you can use some of this. But there have been attempts to create life out of raw chemicals. There was a 10-year project called Cynthia, spelled with an S, and it was eventually abandoned after spending millions of dollars. But the secular scientists will tell you that there's a problem here. They're still waiting for proof that chemical ingredients can spontaneously assemble themselves, become wrapped in a membrane, and divide. In other words, there's still a missing link between the chemistry of early life and subsequent biology. That was in Popular Mechanics. That wasn't in a Christian publication. Or here's another, one of scientists' most enduring mysteries, namely how life sprung from non-living matter. So they know there's a problem here. I have a complete presentation on, it's called Chance in the Origin of Life. I had the privilege of presenting it in the Pickering Nuclear Power Plant, and I had maybe 35 engineers there, most of whom were not believers. At my resource table, a Sikh came up with his turban, and he says to me, how come we never hear about any of this stuff? Well, secular media doesn't want to undermine evolution, do they? So it was a very interesting time there. So the genetic code, let's assume for the sake of discussion how the pre-biological components of life came into existence. Let's just presuppose that. They can't, but let's, for the sake of discussion, we'll call it the hardware of life. But that's not the challenge. The challenge is the whole extra layer of complexity, which is the software of life, is encoded in DNA. The hardware is basically nucleotides, and I'm keeping this simple, but they're basically 4 nucleotides. And they are what make up our DNA. They're the letters in a sense, although when you combine them, you get a letter. In computers, we use zeros and ones. God's information processing system is far more sophisticated. He uses 4, not binary. And there are these 4 nucleotides. A nucleotide is made up of phosphate, a nitrogen group, and a sugar. So every single component in your DNA is made up of sugar. So every one of you is sweet. Somebody might question that. So how many of these nucleotides do we need to string together to put the human DNA? 3 billion. We have to put 3 billion of these nucleotides to spell out words and sentences and paragraphs and chapters. The chapters correspond to the chromosomes. 3 billion of them is what we have to put together. Paul Davies, a physicist, how did nature fabricate the world's first digital information processor, the original living cell, from the blind chaos of blundering molecules? How did molecular hardware get to write its own software? So I'll make you a wager. If you can bring your phone to me and show me that your phone has written its own app, I will pay you $1 million. I have to sell my house in Scarborough, but I will pay you $1 million. You know hardware does not write software. You know that. Why is it that evolutionary biologists have abandoned common sense? There are hardware, blundering molecules, writes information, writes its own program. It's, to be blunt, it's stupid. We know that hardware does not write software. But way beyond this, in terms of DNA, it's absolutely astounding what we know about DNA. Now, Watson and Crick started doing their analysis in the 1950s. I read last week that Watson had just died. But what they discovered up until maybe 2005 or thereabouts is nothing compared to what we've had in the last 20 years. What we've discovered about DNA is absolutely astounding. I read a very, very complex book. Actually, I was flying out to Alberta. It's a great time to catch up on reading. And on dealing with this going on in DNA. And it's overwhelming. Do you know that you can read DNA in both directions? Depending on which direction, you can get different proteins. You can open up the double helix in a different spot, and you can get different proteins being developed. You can combine different parts to get different proteins. In the 1970s, they had this concept called junk DNA. The idea that between the 25,000 genes, there's leftover DNA from an evolutionary process. Completely abandoned that in the literature now. What's between it is called epigenetic information. And it is unbelievable what's going on in there. That information is giving guidance for error correction, for reprogramming the DNA. For example, if a woman conceives and the developing baby stays at a high altitude on top of the Himalayas or the Andes mountains, that baby is going to be born with extra large lung capacity. The developing fetus actually senses atmospheric pressure and the DNA reprograms. That's built into the information in DNA. There's more and more examples of these being found. I could go on about DNA. I have to keep going here. But clearly, it's the signature of God. made by God. Take it up a level. How did cells get nucleuses? Evolutionary biologists have the only theory they basically have is they call it cell capture, but they have never given you an empirical basis for it. But how did multicellular entities come into existence? So if we're starting from an original cell that is supposed to have, with 480 genes roughly, and it's supposed to create different kinds of cells. Across plants and animals, there are thousands of different kinds of cells. In the human body, we have roughly 250 different kinds of cells. How did multicellular entities come into existence, and how did cells agree to talk to one another? If you cut your finger, immediately electrical and chemical signals fire, and the body says, guys, I need some coagulant, and I need it over here quick. Okay, we stop the bleeding. Now I need some subdermal cells. Oh, I need some dermal. Oh, I need a hair follicle. Who's coordinating all this? How did they learn to talk to one another? Take it up a level. In asexual reproduction, like an amoeba, the chromosomes are cloned and then the entity splits. In sexual reproduction, you get two sets of chromosomes that work together. One comes from the sperm and one comes from the egg. How did they decide which set? And what's amazing is when one set of the genetic information is defective, the DNA is intelligent enough, because God has programmed it, to take the information from the other set of chromosomes. You only get an inherited genetic disease carrying forward most of the time if both chromosomes are defective, like through intermarriage, for example, too close and consanguinity. But how did sexual reproduction come into existence? And even if you had a viable life form that had male reproductive organs at the exact same time in the same place, one would have to come into existence with female reproductive organs? Well, the Bible tells us, doesn't it? He created them male and female by their kind. When Darwin published his work called The Origin of Species, came out in 1859, he says if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. So let's call his bluff on this. He knew nothing about DNA. 100 years later, Watson and Crick were starting to decode DNA. And as I mentioned, it's only been in the last 20 years. He knew nothing about genetics. Mendel was doing his work in his monastery in Germany. And 5 years after Darwin had published, he published the first paper on genetics. Nobody paid any attention to genetics until about 1900. Well, we know how important genetics are today. Everything from crime scene investigation through to tracing your ancestors to using CRISPR technology to correct genetic defects and so on. It's just exploded in terms of genetics. Darwin knew nothing about it. He also didn't have a clue about the complexity of cells. In his day, a cell was just an amorphous mass of protoplasm. No complexity in there. We now know that cells are incredible manufacturing facilities. So Darwin, to be blunt, was ignorant. But the biggest problem he has in this statement is how you can take little incremental changes and out of that get more complex entities. So one example right here is the E. coli bacteria and its flagellum. The flagellum is a fascinating piece of engineering because it not only is a rudder, but it is a propeller built into both. It's a rudder and a propeller. And as it spins and moves, the E. coli can navigate. Now, if all you had was a rotor, that bacteria is going nowhere. If all you have is the filament, that bacteria is going nowhere. You have to have every component, those are different proteins there in different colors. every one of those components has to be there all at the same time, or it's not going to go anywhere. In another presentation I have, I refer to the elephant's nose. How did an elephant's nose become a trunk, right? According to evolutionists, you start with a nose and it becomes a trunk. So you're rubbing things, and over time, if you rub enough, it's going to become a trunk. Do you know that in an elephant's trunk, there are 40,000 muscles? 40,000 muscles. And of course, we know about an elephant's trunk, that it's strong enough to pick up logs and delicate enough to pick up greater grass. It can use it for showering, and it can also use it for trumpeting. This is supposed to have evolved through slight incremental changes. So, called Darwin's fluff. Take it up a level, symbiotic relationships. Any of you grow tomatoes? So if you want a lot of tomatoes, you need a particular kind of bee, not the honeybee. The honeybee was imported from Europe. What you need is a bee that's native to the Americas, because tomatoes are native to the Americas. What you need is bumblebees, is what you need. It's interesting, down in Leamington there, we have now probably the world's largest concentration of industrial greenhouses. Literally, the world's largest single concentration. You know, we now get year-round fresh peppers and all kinds of things coming from those greenhouses. It's astounding what we get in our supermarkets now. How do they fertilize the tomato, pollinate the tomatoes in the greenhouses? And these grow very high and tall. They use those accordion platforms that they can go up and down on. One of the ways they can do is use an electrostatic wand, and they vibrate the flowers and the pollen floats around. The other way they do it is they actually bring in a box with bumblebees. They have it shipped in. I'm not sure Canada Post is the most reliable way of getting them there anymore, but they could ship it. And they open a little trap door and the bees fly around in the greenhouse. So you can actually go to YouTube and look at bumblebees pollinating commercial greenhouses. That's how they do it. Why bumblebees? Well, bumblebees are the only bee that hums while it works. Other bees buzz, and it's by shaking their thoraxes and their wings. But bumblebees hum, and they hum at a perfect middle C. And when they hum at a perfect middle C, it vibrates the little yellow flowers open for pollination. If you want lots of tomatoes, get other plants bumblebees like, and you'll get more tomatoes. Evolutionists have great difficulty explaining symbiotic relationships. One more example, the origin of human language. Human language is very, very complex. Evolutionists would originally have told you that it evolved, information increasing, starting from grunts and groans out in the African savannah, if you believe the out of Africa theory. But the interesting thing is that older languages are more complex than newer languages. Lisa, I use an example, so I'm going to pick on you. You told me once that one of your, Lisa teaches English in Quebec City, and you told me that one of your students asked you once, she said, Miss Hughes, how come in English we don't have vous and tu, right? Versus, well, we used to in the King James, like thee and thou and that kind of thing. But languages are actually devolving. They're losing complexity through time. So in the English language, we have basically two components making it up. The Germanic side, the Anglo-Saxon side, and the French side after the conquest, the Norman conquest in 1066. So we've got the French side. French is a more complex language than English, structurally. But if you go back in that Indo-European family of languages, Latin is older and it's more complex. If you go older, Greek is more complex. And if you go back to Sanskrit, it's even more complex. What is happening with languages? They're devolving. They're becoming less complex through time. There's also been a common vocabulary decline. It is estimated that in the time of William Shakespeare, in his corpus, there's about 60,000 words. The average native English speaker in the Elizabethan period is estimated to have been able to use 15,000 words. That's more than just comprehending them. Use them. 30,000 words, half of the Shakespearean corpus. It's estimated that today, the average native English speaker can use about 15,000 words, half of what they could in the Elizabethan period, and the average teenager can only use about 100. So in the past, there was attempts to find the common proto-language from which every language is dealt. They gave that up. And nowadays, they talk about the bushes of language. They can't understand. There's no way that you can explain how all these different forms of language could have come from a single common origin. And roughly around 2200 BC, all of a sudden, a whole bunch of languages appear in the historical record, and many of them have written forms, whether it's cuneiform or hieroglyphics or symbolic or alphabetic, they all suddenly appear. Well, again, Genesis 1 to 11 is critical here. It actually tells us how these languages came into existence. If you go to Wikipedia, not highly recommended as a source of reliable information, but if you go to Wikipedia and look at the original languages, they don't mention the Tower of Babel, and they're trying to explain how languages originate. There's two basic theories. Well, human language confirms the biblical account and is contrary to evolution. There's devolution, decay going on, not increasing information, decreasing information. A few pieces of information just to communicate that the Earth cannot be billions of years old. I was speaking at the Markham Missionary Church last Sunday, and because I'd been there previously, this time I did a presentation on the age of the Earth. And before the talk, I was at the table, and a person came up to me and he said, he and two other buddies had been talking over coffee, and he says to me, we've been debating about whether we can believe in the young Earth or the old Earth. And I said, I can't start. I knew he wanted to engage me right there in debate. And I said, we got to get downstairs. We're going to be presenting. And I said, here's what I want you to do. Afterwards, if I've semi-convinced you, I want you to come up and let me know. Afterwards, he came up and he one word. He said, convinced. So there is unbelievable amount of evidence to support that the Earth is young. So I'm just giving you a few examples. I've mentioned nuclear DNA. There's also a chunk of DNA in another part of most of our cells. It's called mitochondrial DNA. Now, what is the mitochondria? It is basically the central processing unit that runs the manufacturing facility in cells. It also generates the electricity. Chemically, it's called ATP, but it does all of the signals inside the cell to run the manufacturing plant that's going on there. We inherit our mitochondria DNA only from our mothers. Our nuclear DNA, we have two sets from our mothers and our fathers, 23 chromosomes from each. The mitochondria DNA is different structurally. Nuclear DNA is a double helix. Mitochondria DNA is a ring. It has 16,600 nucleotides. 16,600, minuscule compared with 3 billion. That little ring, 16,600, there's 37 genes in there compared with 25,000 genes. So you can actually sequence this mitochondria DNA in a few seconds using modern sequencing techniques. And you can take blood samples from all over the world and create a huge database and sequence this rapidly. Mitochondria DNA is very robust. It has some mutations in it, but not the way nuclear DNA has mutated. Now, there are basically 3 sets of mitochondria DNA in the human population. Anybody want to venture a reason for why there are 3 basic sets of mitochondria DNA in the human population? It's because of the wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Every one of us is descended from Shem, Ham, and Jesus' wives, because we inherit from our mothers. We don't know which wife belonged to which husband, so don't start making any supposition from that. But there are basically three sets. And you can see the mutation differences that have occurred, and you can go back and get basically those three original sets. And you can even go back a step further, because there have been some mutations from Eve, who's the mother of all living. In fact, I think, isn't that what Eve means? The mother of all living, or something like that. And you can actually determine within a 99.99% purity of what Eve's actual mitochondria DNA look like. And in geneticists, they actually call it mitochondrial Eve. They don't believe in the biblical Eve, but they actually call it mitochondrial Eve. So we know that there have been some mutations, and a study was done to determine what rate these are occurring. And this study looked at a lineal ancestral approach. One of the examples in the case studies was using the Russian Romanov family. So if you picture, I'm inventing this scenario, but it's consistent with the article. Picture that in St. Petersburg, in the museum there's a hairbrush from Princess Katerina. And you can get the complete hair with the little stub on the end of it, and you can get the DNA, mitochondria DNA from that hair. We know who our great-grandchildren are. We pluck a hair sample, and within seconds we can compare the mitochondria DNA. Well, Ann Gibbons reports that they were expecting a certain number of mutations because they made a faulty assumption that mankind had been on the earth for, say, as Homo sapiens, 200,000 years. And they were stunned to discover that these mutations were occurring quite a bit more rapidly. And she says that the measured rate indicates that mankind's only been on the earth for 6,000 years. And then, of course, she goes on and says, but nobody believes that. So we have, there's many more examples of looking at mitochondria DNA I won't go into right now, but in other species there is. Second piece of evidence suggests that the Earth cannot be billions of years old, and certainly not humans millions of years old, is genomic decay. That is, the human genome is decaying rapidly. In the human population right now, there's roughly 1,000 genetic diseases, and generations are inheriting them. And mutations in nuclear DNA are relatively, many of them are benign. That is, if you have a spelling mistake in an entire paragraph, you can still make sense out of it. However, occasionally, they're not benign. I'll just use an example using alphabetic characters. But if in a string there was G-O-D and somehow it got flipped and now you have D-O-G, suddenly the paragraph doesn't work anymore. So occasionally mutations are negative. Generally, they seem to be benign. Nobody has ever demonstrated a positive mutation. They've claimed that they have them, but they've never demonstrated. I can't go into that, but I have another presentation showing that. If somebody wants me to give the evidence, I can during the Q&A. But let's assume that benign or negative is the default position here. Mutations are accumulating, and they are accumulating in every generation. Roughly, each generation has 200 mutations more than the previous generation. Sanford, in his book, he was a geneticist at Cornell University, and he's written a book called Genetic Entropy, and he indicates that in roughly 300 generations, the human population will go extinct because the genetic load, entropy load, the decay, will just basically wipe out the human population. We are roughly 200 generations since Adam. We don't have to worry about this. Christ is going to take care of this long before. Why do I know that? Because, again, in Genesis 1 to 11, we have a promise that God is never going to wipe out the earth again. Remember that in the covenant he made with Noah? See how important just 1 to 11 is in terms of our worldview? Another piece of example, Mary Schweitzer writing, she was the first, and actually on our website today, in our Friday mailings, there's another example of Mary Schweitzer's work. She's been doing this for over 30 years, but she was the first to publish in the Smithsonian, and she had found soft tissue and blood cells in T-Rex bones. And after she published, there was a hue and cry because evolution said, this is impossible. Organic material does not last 65 million years. I've never seen a best before date of 65 million years. Well, she's gone on publishing, and if you go to our website today, you'll see another example of a recent one. In fact, it's in our Creation magazine, so it's right now that it's in our magazine, but it's on the website. In our database in CMI, we have over 130 papers dealing with soft tissue in bones. 60 of them are in dino bones. So this stuff is being found all the time, and there is no conceivable way, no explanation for how this stuff could have survived so long and not have just disappeared, particularly blood cells. They deteriorate relatively quickly. Burying them for 4,500 years after the flood, that's a possibility, but it's impossible in 65 million years. And here's an example from Saskatchewan about 2 years ago. Soft tissue found in a T-Rex bone. Notice how the CBC reports it, our illustrious objective media, right? CBC. For centuries, it's been thought that there is effectively no trace of biological tissue in the fossil. And there shouldn't be. Turns out this is quite as straightforward, or maybe not as rapid as we thought it would be. They don't explain it. This is pure waffle. Is all it is. So, one more example. The Earth is a big giant magnet. There's a current running around it, and it creates a magnetic field called the magnetosphere. And that protects us from inbound cosmic rays, and it also provides a navigational aid for animals. I wrote a paper, you can find it on our website, that even dogs use the magnetic field to navigate. It was a science research project that was done in the Czech Republic. They put GPS devices on dogs, got them well confused, stuck them way out, and they watched them navigate home. And they can smell home senses up to 15 kilometers away, and they can align to magnetic north and south. Dogs. Now, pottery was formed, say, 1,000 years ago, and when there was pieces of iron in clay and it was fired, it takes on a magnetic moment. You can read its magnetism with a very robust magnetometer. If you take the same clay bed and fire the same type of firing techniques to create the same type of porcelain or clay vessel, over a 1,000-year period, the magnetic field of the Earth has declined by 40%. And its strength is declining very rapidly if the curve continues in about 1,000 years. There will not be a magnetic field on the Earth. We won't be able to go outside because we'll be fried and birds will be flying in the wrong direction. Well, secular world knows this is a problem. Our planet's protective shell isn't quite what it used to be. Over the past 2 centuries, its magnetic strength has taken a nosedive. And nobody has the foggiest idea why. Well, that's not true. I know why. Because the Earth is decaying, and it's decaying rapidly. It's not old. It's just tired. And Paul tells us in Romans 8, the whole creation is groaning, waiting for its redemption. And Jesus is going to recreate, according to what Peter says, and it's going to be instantaneous. There just isn't time for evolution. Just a few facts to support the biblical account of the flood. Massive extinctions. I was out in Drumheller, and it's unbelievable that different kinds of fossils are being found out there. How do you explain, using any modern view of geology or climatology or weather patterns, erosion, I don't care what you look at, that's going to explain these massive collections of a mixture of fossils that are found. Worldwide sediment layers. There is a sediment layer that runs from the middle of Manitoba out to the Rockies and down into the United States. How do you explain a continent-wide sediment layer? You can't explain it using a river delta. And if you line up Africa and Brazil, South America, the sediment layers are they're essentially identical much of the way up, because during the flood, that sediment was being laid down, and then partway through the flood, roughly about the day of 150, the original continents being split apart. The underground water, the fountains of the deep, had come up and exploded all this massive quantity of acidic hot water through about 25,000 volcanoes. And this water had to go somewhere because it come from underground aquifers. And the tectonic plate shifting is occurring. Now there's going to be deep oceans and the water is going to run in. Now, some of the sediment then was laid down after the continents had started to split apart. The soft sediment was there, and as the massive quantities of water are rushing down into the new forming ocean basins, it's carving out the Grand Canyon, and then the Colorado River follows the path of least resistance. It wasn't formed by the river followed the formation. And we have an interesting example that occurred in 1980 when Mount St. Helens exploded and sediment came washing down. And notice how it was laid down. And within 5 years, this was hardening into rock. I was reading the Mount Rainier, or is it Rainier? I'm not sure how to pronounce it. In Washington, looks like it's going to explode. And there's concern people are going to have to be prepared to evacuate. But it may provide us with another example. The rapid sediment deposition. The layers have ripple marks and imprints of leaves and footprints and so on. You can only explain that if the sediment layers are being laid down gently and rapidly. And you even have soft tissue impressions in the fossil record. Sometimes they can actually see the impression of skin, for example. It can only occur if it's rapid sediment deposition that's just freezing in time. In the canyons, you look at the layers, they are razor thin. You cannot explain that if those layers were laid down over millions of years, because there should be erosion and soil formation. Tree trunks that run up through multiple layers of sediment. There are about 50 petrified forests around the world where there are many tree trunks running up. You cannot explain that using current thinking, geological thinking, because it would have eroded long ago, the tree. Soft sediment will buckle and twist as the new continents are forming through major tectonic shifting at the end of the flood. But you can't explain that if it's hard rock. So if you try to explain this using modern geological thinking. Other examples are unexplainable without the Genesis flood. So Peter tells us that we should be prepared to give a defense for what we believe. And a simple question, could you actually defend your belief in biblical creation? So back in the back there, we have blue and white line clipboards. Could we pass them around, please? On every Friday, we send out just the blue and white ones right now. Every Friday, we send out our info bites, and we give you the latest information. And I'd encourage you to sign up, be part of our subscriber list. Every alternate weeks, we send it just to the Canadian subscribers and then globally on alternate weeks. So that is one way to stay informed. We like to have the postal code because it helps us in terms of letting you know events that are coming in your neighborhood. It'll give you précis of the latest articles, it'll tell you our latest books and so on. We have a really good apologetics book called Christianity for Skeptics that explains why Christianity is true compared with other religions. And we have our most purchased book and our popular book, which we keep right up to date. The copies I have down start in the 10th edition. It's our Creation Answers book that addresses in brief form most of the questions that we get. And you don't have to read this from cover to cover. You can just look at the particular topic that you're interested in, but you could read it cover to cover, and you can buy them as a pair. We have an updated version of Achilles' heel, and by our PhD scientists in biology and chemistry and accompanying DVD, and the Genesis account by Jones and Sarfati. He has his PhD in chemistry and a good theology background. And then we have our library starter pack, which is just an amazing amount of really good material. Over $330 worth of material if you were to buy it individually for $200. We also have Creation Magazine. Can we pass around the other clipboards now? Creation Magazine is oriented to families, and we have been publishing it for over 40 years. It's the longest going journal in the creation space, and we distribute it to over 100 countries. We charge $9.50 when we send it out as a paper copy, and then we also give you access to the PDF version, and you can distribute that. We are not in the business of making money. We don't sell any of this material to make money. If we price it at cost, the only way that we fund CMI is through donations. That's the only way. If you're interested in it and you sign up today, you can get a free copy right now, and you can take one of the DVDs. It's beside the Creation Magazine I have. Here are some examples of articles that are down there that were in my library copies. Tear off the bottom form, fill in both sides, and we only charge you $9.50 when we mail it out, and you can cancel at any time in the future, but we only charge $9.50 each time. There, we have a few of these children's packs available. I think we've already sold 2 this morning. Then there's the younger ones for younger children, but mothers or dads need to read it to their kids. Creation Answers book for kids, and you don't have to spend any money. At creation.com, we have thousands and thousands of articles and available, and lots of free videos available, so you can access them. We also have our media channels, as I mentioned earlier, just been exploding, and we've moved to writing, instead of writing half-hour scripts, we're now going to snippets, because people don't even have the attention span to watch a half-hour show anymore. So we're moving toward small snippets of information. So you can connect with us through Creation Magazine or Info Bites. In the church today, sadly, there are people who are undermining the belief in what God has told us in Genesis chapter 1, and in fact, in first 11 chapters of Genesis, they also question the Genesis flood as a global flood. We need to get the seminary faculty, the pastors, the Sunday school teachers, parents who are homeschooling, and so on, everybody aligned, undermining this pernicious myth called evolution. I'll just close with one example. Whenever I have kids, and I'm doing a kids talk, well, it's an adult talk too, but I do a dino talk. A dino is a man. And I have an initial slide that I put up, and it has 4 things on it: a fish, a bird, a dolphin, and a T-Rex. And I was at a homeschoolers conference with these kids that are basically somewhat isolated. And I asked, what is the oldest creature on here? Almost invariably, they say the T-Rex. See how pernicious this is? Because T-Rexes were actually created on the 6th day, whereas the birds and the sea creatures were created on the 5th day. So the T-Rex is actually a day younger. But evolution just permeates our culture. So we can go to the Q&A now, I believe. How much? I'm way over time.
Take your 15 minutes.
Okay. Yes?
Okay, so like, I'm a creationist, I don't think of the world as being millions of years old, but I am curious, like when God created the earth, did he create like I don't know how to say, but like indwelled age and things? Because
Sorry, what?
did God create like indwelled age and things?
That's a very good question.
And like, I'm trying to say, like, I am a creationist, I'm not trying to.
Yeah, no, I understand.
But like in the garden, there were already
Trees that
were
had
fully
full
grown.
fruit with
Yeah,
seeds. Right. And Adam and Eve were basically adults,
yeah,
right? There was a river, so it had the appearance of erosion.
yeah.
The river flowed out of Eden and split into four. There were high hills. There was on and on and on. Lots of examples. We refer to that as the mature creation. God created the earth to be inhabited. In fact, if there's a passage, I think it's in Isaiah 45, where God actually says, I created the earth to be inhabited. He actually says that. And so birds could fly, right? Everything was there that man could have. So we refer to it as a mature creation. God isn't deceiving us because he tells us what he did, right? But there's an appearance of process to get there. Let me use an example from the New Testament. If you'd have been on the shore of the Sea of Galilee and Jesus was there and he gets a little boy's lunch and he starts to break it up into pieces, if you'd have seen that fish and that bread that he's handing out, you'd say, oh, that bread was 3 days old. And yet it came into existence instantly. The fish, they were swimming in the Sea of Galilee before that. Or you go back to Cana of Galilee and he fills up jars of water, and then what happens? He turns it into wine. The wine steward tastes it and says, the best wine I've ever tasted, right? It was made instantaneously, and yet it had an appearance of age. Appearance of age is not evidence of age.
Yeah, okay.
Okay?
I was just curious about that,
No.
because I know like I've had like discussions, well, it was old and
Yeah.
Adam and Eve, they were old, and I was like, oh.
So that, I deal with all that in the Age of the Earth presentation, the one I gave last Sunday morning. But one always becomes a stumbling block is how come we can see starlight? Because if the stars are billions and billions of kilometers away, how could Adam and Eve see stars on the sixth day? Right? So that's a stumbling block. I have another presentation dealing with that. And Jason Lyle becomes a key component of that, right, of his thinking. All right? Yes, sir.
So if we're basing our days off of the cycle of night and day, then for areas on the earth as a whole that have 6 months as a quote unquote day, the light and dark, how
Because of
would
the
you-
axial tilt.
But even if it was straight, would it not still have a difference? Like, how would you account for that tilt on the axis?
Yeah, yeah. And,
We're going to build the
on
earth.
the June,
so-
on the June solstice, it basically doesn't get dark. They go golfing at midnight up in the Arctic. So when we're talking about some of these phenomena, we're not talking about the unique little points like the polar